Hello and welcome to a long overdue return of Faith versus Faith, the show in which I compare and contrast Jehovah's Witnesses with other high control groups. Today I'm speaking with Dr Jill Mytton and Ian McKay, both of whom are former members of the Exclusive Brethren. Jill is a psychologist and expert on religious abuse, and Ian is an expert on the history of his former church. Jill and Ian, thanks so much for joining me.
Hello.
Hello.
So much to get through, and I'm fascinated to delve into this subject because I've been fascinated by the Exclusive Brethren for some time now. Ian, perhaps you could just give us a brief rundown of the history of the movement from the earliest beginnings up to the current leadership.
The movement was founded on radically non-sectarian principles. The idea behind it was that they were not a sect or a denomination. They held to the principle that they would take the Lord's Supper with any godly Christian who happened to come along, even if he belonged to some other denomination. But they departed quite radically from this radically non-sectarian principle, and gradually instead became probably more sectarian than any church I know. They went from one extreme to the other. They changed in many other ways too. They became more dictatorial, more dogmatic, more sectarian, and more controlling, and eventually more deceptive, and resorted to very harsh treatment of anyone who disagreed with their universal leader.
It's sounding eerily familiar to my experience with Jehovah's Witnesses, and in fact, just before we went on air, I was reading some of Jill's thesis. She's written a fantastic thesis on the religion, and some of the similarities are just eerie. Jill, in a short while, I want to pick your brains about the psychological effects of the church's teachings. But first, could you give us some idea of your background with the church and what prompted you to leave?
Okay, I was born into the Brethren, as indeed almost all current members are. They don't proselytize, so nobody joins. My parents were also members of the Brethren, and they were born into the Brethren too. So it's a long generational history. And my father, during the 1950s, was becoming increasingly more discontented with what the Brethren were beginning to develop in terms of doctrines. And in 1960, in December, he and my mother decided to leave the Brethren, and because I was only just 16, I obviously went with them. But that created for me an enormous turmoil in my life, such that it took me at least 30 years before I could really start thinking about it and dealing with that.
Why the turmoil? Because obviously you're leaving with your parents. So how would you summarize?
I was a very good little sister. I did what I was meant to do because I wanted to be accepted. I wanted to be part of this group because I felt that was where safety lay. That was where love lay. But I didn't realize that they were also scaring me at the same time with all their tales of hell and abandonment and rejection and all the rest of it. So, but I thought as long as I did what I was expected to do, then I would be saved and everything would be wonderful. So when my parents decided to leave, it was like an earthquake in a way, because all of a sudden that security that I had, which actually it was a false security, just vanished. And I had to start completely thinking again, except that I didn't know how to.
Sure. I can understand the turmoil that must have produced. Yeah. And Ian, perhaps you could give us some idea of your background with the movement and what prompted you to leave.
I was brought up from childhood in the Exclusive Brethren in Glasgow, and that was, I was born in 1944, and during the 1940s and 90s, it was still a fairly benign, fairly harmless sect. Extreme, certainly fundamentalist, with eccentric ideas, but not seriously harmful. It was in the 1960s that it underwent a radical change and became very similar to people like the Jehovah's Witnesses, Church of Scientology, and the Moonies, and a whole, there are probably hundreds of other similar abusive sects around. I was quite unhappy with the leadership of the church at that time. It was led by a chap called James Taylor Jr., and he introduced more than 200 new rules, many of which seemed rather irrational and unscriptural and immoral to my reckoning, and harmful and oppressive. But I went along with it. I wasn't at all convinced by his teachings, and I wasn't a fundamentalist in my own thinking. I thought it was, I knew from quite an early age that the Bible contains hundreds of contradictions, factual errors, and could not be regarded in any sense as global. But that didn't worry me. I didn't worry about the fact that the Brethren were fundamentalists and I wasn't. I tolerate fundamentalism, but I couldn't really tolerate it. Began to treat people badly. What really made me decide that Bretherism was not for me was a feeling of disgust at the way people were being treated. Not the way I was being treated. They treated me all right, up to a point. But I was disgusted by the way they treated anyone who had reservations about their teaching, about their leadership. And I made this known in 1968. And there was a new departure. The universal leader sent to the assembly in Glasgow instructions that we were to excommunicate the entire meeting in Hamilton, which is a nearby assembly near to Glasgow. We met for that purpose, and we were not told what the people in Hamilton had done wrong. We were not told in principle or facts. We were just told that as a matter of obedience to the leader, we had to excommunicate the whole lot, including children. But this was a radical departure from the principles that the Brethren had held to in the past and the precedents, including scriptural precedents. So at a meeting of nearly 1,000 Brethren, I was the only one to raise questions about what we were doing that night. Out of 1,000. I know there were many there that agreed with me, but they were afraid to say so. And thereafter, I stayed on for a while. I didn't say I was leaving the Brethren. I wanted to stay on and try to convince at least some of them that they'd got things badly wrong. So it wasn't until about a year later in 1969 that they formally excommunicated. And then in 1970, most of those in Glasgow.
So just to clarify, they excommunicated you.
Yes.
Yeah.
I didn't want to excommunicate them. I wanted to make it clear that this business of separation was something they practiced, not something I practiced.
Yeah.
And then a year later, some of them came to me and said, well, actually, you were quite right what you were saying about Mr. Taylor. he blew his cover at Aberdeen about a year later. And most of the Brethren in Glasgow then agreed with me that his leadership had been a dreadful he was an imposter, a fraud. As I said to my mother before I left, I think the man's a fraud. And then a year later, a lot of the brethren in Glasgow thought the same.
Fascinating. So what I'd really like to know, and this is a question I'm trying to ask of all of my guests who are joining the channel, both from other religions and from Jehovah's Witnesses, just to try and give a little bit of balance to things, because I'm mindful that there might be believers who watch this video. Do you feel that there are any positives from your time in the church? Perhaps Jill, if you...
It's an interesting question, and it's come up a few times on the ex-brethren Facebook groups. And there's a bunch of people who adamantly say, as I do, no. I simply really struggle to find anything positive. Obviously, I loved my parents to bits, but you know, that's a bit different. I really struggle, but other people appreciate some of the things that they learnt while they were in the Brethren. But I can't think of anything. I don't know if Ian can.
Ian, can you think of any positives?
Yes, I can remember some positives, particularly from the early days, the 1940s and the 1950s. At that time, in Scotland anyway, the Brethren approved of scholarship and even approved of science, and they expressed pleasure and encouragement to any of their young people who were doing well in their studies or at school or at university. And a much greater proportion of them went to university than the proportion in the general population. At that time, there was only about 3% of 18-year-olds in Scotland went to university, and a much greater proportion of the Brethren's young people did that. Now, that was a positive that didn't last for long, because in the early 1960s, that disproportion was completely reversed, and the Brethren were prevented from going to university. And to this day, not only are they prevented from going to university, they're prevented from studying in depth the great majority of academic subjects that they're capable of studying.
That's definitely a commonality that with Jehovah's Witnesses, going all the way back to the time of Charles Taze Russell, who's the founder. The organization's been against higher education and been extremely averse to the idea of higher learning and going to college and university. And it seems we're not alone in that. And obviously that has its impact on people's lives, because apart from not being able to better themselves, their earning potential is severely limited. Jill, one thing I was wondering, you mentioned earlier about the Brethren not being evangelical and basically just repopulating themselves by having children. At what age are Brethren members normally baptized?
They follow the child baptism. Sorry, I'll say that again. The Brethren baptize their children, so from a very early age they are considered members of the Brethren. When Ian and I were in the Brethren, interestingly, by the way, we're both born in the same year, and yet you've already seen our experiences are considerably different, because in those days there were differences between different localities. Whereas now with the internet and the phone and everything else, there's much more universality, I think. But the scarier bit for me is that when I was in the Brethren, we had to ask to break bread. In other words, we had to ask to be part of the Holy Communion. But it was called breaking of bread. And I remember that day very vividly, because it was one of my traumatic experiences, feeling so pressured and so scared that if I didn't, I would go to hell. That at the age of 13, I remember calling my father in to ask him, and he was very worried because I was so upset about the whole thing. But now, I'm not sure when that came in, Ian might know, children, as the minute they put their hand out to reach the wine or the bread as it's going round, that's considered they are asking for it, and therefore they're now in fellowship. So you can.
Good grief! So
Yeah.
literally, a motion of the body indicates that they're ready. Wow.
Yes. Yes.
And Ian, I'm hoping you can clarify something. I obviously tried to do a bit of research on the Brethren before this video, and one kind of roadblock that I came up against was trying to understand how big the religion is.
You mean numerically?
Numerically, yeah.
Well, I think there's somewhere between 45,000 and 50,000 globally,
right?
Counting children. Can I ask you a question?
Sure, by all means.
You have obviously noticed and commented on the similarity in the methods that different sects use to keep control and exact control over the members. Why is there such a close similarity? Is it because they copy one another's methods, or is it because they have independently discovered these methods?
I think it's a case of you actually see it in nature, and this is just my opinion, but one thing that amazed me when I last went to the Natural History Museum is in one of the halls. You look up on the wall, and they've got fossils hanging on the wall of ichthyosaurs, and they look like dolphins, but they're not. They're dinosaurs. They're reptiles, but they're more or less the same shape as dolphins, because it turns out that shape is ideally suited to catching prey.
This is an example of convergent evolution.
Yeah, that's the correct phrase. Yeah, I think that when a certain way of doing things is optimal for keeping people under control, the organizations will find their way towards it organically. That's my opinion. Yeah.
I think that's right. I mean, we can look across any group and we'll find the same practices. The beliefs are very often different, but the practices are very often very, very similar.
Indeed.
There are some differences, as we've already noted.
It's striking that in some of the oppressive sects in Japan, which are not based on Christianity or the Christian Bible, some of them use very similar methods too, which I think is enough to prove that the methods are not based on the Bible.
Indeed. And some of these, like you say, some of these groups can have outrageously different beliefs. Sometimes people assume that Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons are similar because they similarly engage in door-to-door preaching and that kind of thing. But the actual theology is wildly different between the two groups. It's just that, again, when there's a certain way of controlling people and it works, both groups are going to find it eventually. And the way I think of it is it's like the same engine but different bodywork. So the same kind of mechanisms whirring away underneath the hood. Now, if a Brethren member were here now joining our discussion, perhaps he wasn't aware that Jill and Ian were here, and that would make it easier. What would their pitch likely be for persuading me to join the church?
They wouldn't. They don't try to persuade anyone to join their church. They gave that up as a lost cause many years ago. Recruitment to the Exclusive Brethren occurred historically mainly by recruiting people who were already members of some other church, not from recruiting unbelievers and converting them. But even that kind of recruitment dried up almost completely by about 1950. Because they found they couldn't do it and decided to make a virtue out of a necessity and decided that it was best not to.
It says a lot about the power of childhood indoctrination that the religion can number into the tens of thousands just purely from indoctrinating kids and making zero effort to recruit new members. It's quite a chilling thing, that.
But they go at they carry out great lengths to keep people in, people who want to leave. They give them plenty of carrots to try and keep them there.
Sure.
You know, trips to Australia for a start, you know, to go and see the big man of God down there.
Of course. What's his name again? Hales, is it?
They give them Bruce Hales.
Bruce Hales. Okay.
They give them houses, jobs, cars, you know, anything to keep a person in.
Amazing. Yeah. Amazing. So, if I'm asked for my laundry list sorry, go on.
No, I was just saying they have very large families. If you could see my brother's family tree, it's huge. You know, whereas if you look at mine, it's just me and my 2 daughters and 3 grandchildren. So
it does certainly seem that way.
That's what they do.
Yeah. And I'm going to come on to family shortly.
Yeah.
But if I'm asked for my laundry list of abusive watchtower teachings and practices, there are 5 that I normally cite. And I talk about shunning, I talk about child sex abuse, I talk about the refusal of blood transfusions, I talk about the denial of higher education, and I talk about the issues with domestic violence in the religion. So are there any, you've already mentioned higher education, but are there any brethren teachings or practices that you consider harmful? And that's to both of you.
Where do we start?
Well, number 1 among the harmful teachings is the teaching that you must separate from anyone that disagrees with you on religious matters. They call it separation from evil, but they don't practice separation from evil. They practice separation from anyone that disagrees with you, especially anyone who disagrees with the leadership. And as a result, I don't know of a single Brethren family that has remained intact with all their extended families still speaking to one another. And number 2 evil, the second greatest evil, is the restrictions on education. These are the 2 that I think tower above all the other evils.
Yes, and now they have their own Brethren schools. So the children are in fact in contact only with Brethren 24/7, really. The teachers are not Brethren because they don't go to higher education, they don't have their own teachers. But the teachers are constrained to some extent as to what they can teach and how they can teach whatever the subject is. I mean, for me, it's more on the sort of human side of things, in that a child as it's growing up needs to feel that unconditional love for good, sound, secure attachments to form. But not many children in the Brethren actually experience that, because the person who's offering them that love is often confused with the Brethren system itself. So in other words, the family and the Brethren seem to be the same thing. They seem to be merged. And yet it's the Brethren and the family that also bring the threat to the child, the threat of the fear of eternal damnation and hell. And they speak of burning in hell. I'm sure the Jehovah's Witnesses have that as well. They
don't have hell, but the imagery of Armageddon, basically it's not forever, it's not eternal torture, but when you think of the imagery of Armageddon and buildings collapsing and huge chasms opening up in the ground and fireballs coming from the sky, it can be scary even if it's not forever, you know. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. So that's the problem I have with being brought up in such a restricted environment, and one that is kind of full of fear and threat. But there's also the question, which I guess is linked to what Ian said, which is the whole question of critical thinking. The reason I was such a good little sister was because nobody had ever said to me, you can disagree if you want to. You know, so I never learned how to disagree. I never learned to say, hang on a minute, that doesn't quite add up. How can you say that? And how can that also be true?
You use the phrase, Jill, good little sister. Am I to understand that women are treated differently to men in the movement?
Definitely, yes. We are good little sisters. It's our job to sorry, it was my job to obey, basically, and not to be who I wanted to be at all, not even to think about who I wanted to be, but to kind of follow the constraints that we had. And it's clear to me that the constraints I had were greater than, for example, Ian's. And I think part of that I touch on in my thesis, actually, because I realized as I listened to these 6 stories, that people who are born into multi-generational families, in other words, the families go back in time in whichever group it is, they tend to be more enmeshed in the whole thing. They tend to be more caught up in it. So it never even occurred to me that I could leave. I mean, what do you mean leave? It wasn't a concept that entered even into my head, whereas it's clear that Ian and some of the other people that I spoke to were busily thinking, even as children, I want to leave, I need to leave, I'll have to leave or I'll go mad. Those thoughts never entered my head. They also never entered one other person, Rachel, in my thesis.
And is it the case that women aren't to involve themselves in teaching?
Yeah,
yeah,
very much. They are now allowed, apparently, to give out hymns in the morning meetings, because I don't know about Jehovah's Witnesses, but in the Brethren, the meetings aren't structured. Well, they're kind of unofficially structured. You start with a hymn, then you have a prayer, then you have the bread, and so on and so forth. But they don't have appointed people to give out hymns. The hymns aren't chosen in advance.
You mean the sheets with the lyrics?
No, they have a hymn book. And
so they hand out the hymn books?
No, everybody's got their own hymn book,
right,
with their own initials on it. And they all have their own John Darby Bible as well, with your initials on it.
Right.
And so a woman on a Sunday morning will open the hymn book and say, let's sing hymn number 23.
Oh, I see. Right.
And then a man, one of the brothers, will then start the tune. Of course, everything's a cappella. They don't have musical instruments in the church. I don't know if the JW...
Oh, no, we're well ahead with you there. Flat screen televisions. And you don't even need a songbook now. I went to a meeting a few weeks back. Obviously, they didn't know who I was. I was just there as an observer, and you don't even need a songbook because the lyrics are up on the flat screen.
Oh gosh, no, they haven't got that. I don't think they've got that technological, have they, Ian? We have heard of business meetings where they've streamed whatever's going on in the meeting. You know, the learning, the teaching has been screened worldwide, and they had to pay a lot of money to go and sit and watch this screen. But not in the meetings, no.
Wow.
Yes, it would be too much of a volte-face to have audio-visual technology in the meeting rooms, because it used to be condemned in extreme terms as being something that was being used by the devil and something that was diabolical and something you shouldn't even touch, computers and videos and things like that.
Well, I actually wanted to ask you about technology because this is something that you guys don't know. I've not mentioned it to Jill. I used to work when I was a Jehovah's Witness, I spent maybe a couple of years working for a company that supplied employment law manuals and employment law coverage for businesses. And they had a large portfolio of Plymouth Brethren clients, because obviously you have these large companies that are family companies, and they have their own kind of rules, basically. And it was the job of my company to indemnify them against, in the event of employment disputes and that kind of thing. So I was tasked with actually writing from note, based on notes from the consultants. I had to write a lot of the manuals for these Plymouth Brethren companies, and it was very clear that they were averse to technology. They were they had rules about use of computers and I think mobile phones and all sorts of things. It was a constant source of humor in our office, whenever we were going over the Plymouth Brethren clients' documents. So what is the stance on technology, and what's the reason behind it?
You want the stance now or the stance as it was a few years ago?
As well, if it's changed, then just let me know sort of briefly.
Well, originally,
yeah.
The internet was regarded as the pipeline of filth. So the internet was out, fax machines were out, mobile phones were out. That was probably about 20 or 30 years ago, I think.
Even the barcode scanners at a supermarket checkout were something that the then leader, John Hill, described as something that gives you a sense of terror when you see it being used. You thought there was something inherently evil and sinister.
Very easily to terrorize him, wasn't it? Good grief.
Well, the number 666 is on every barcode.
Oh, of course, yeah. Well, this would have been around, let me think, this would have been around 2005, 2006 that they were, they had these policies that were against computers, and I remember looking into them briefly because obviously it was causing me a bit of dissonance because I was seeing to a degree similarities with my own religion, and I remember finding it funny that when I searched online, I could actually find a Plymouth Brethren website, even though they were against the use of computers. I found that interesting.
Yes,
I think it's quite difficult to rationalise and explain the reason behind the Brethren's reservations about computers. If you ask them today, they'll say they were afraid of them because of the connection to the internet, but that's not the explanation. The ban on using or touching or owning computers was introduced by Jim Sangmanton before any of them knew anything about the internet or knew that it was possible to connect the computer to the internet. So it was nothing to do with the internet. It might have been simply a rather silly whim. It could be that Jim Sangmanton didn't know how to use the computers and didn't want to show his ignorance, so he disapproved of them. Or it might be part of the larger scale Brethren narrative to the effect that the world is getting worse and worse, and to maintain that narrative they keep trying to quote examples. So anything that's novel, any new technology or new development or new legislation is depicted as being sinister and wicked and dangerous, as part of the story about how the world's getting worse. In fact, it's a very deceptive story because the world's not getting worse. In almost every sense that matters, the world, in the short term or a longer term, on the scale of decades or centuries or millennia, the world's becoming less violent, more morally defensible. People are becoming better behaved, more law-abiding. And it's exactly the opposite from what the Brethren are trying to say and what the Jehovah's Witnesses are trying to say.
I was going to say that's exactly what JW say. They say that, well, we know we're in the last days, or the last days of the last days, because look how bad the world is. And I always say, well, would you rather be living now or 50 years ago? You know, I know when I'd rather be living. It's very, very bizarre how they managed to conjure up this false narrative of how awful the world is. Now, speaking of technology, I was on the Plymouth Brethren YouTube channel maybe 2 or 3 hours ago. I look, by the way, it's a whole subgenre of videos when you're looking at videos by cults for cult members. It's a fascinating thing to see. And there was a video titled Plymouth Brethren Living Our Beliefs Family. And it was basically a 2-minute video that was promoting the Plymouth Brethren's approach to the family. I found it fascinating that the comments were disabled. That's a huge red flag straight away. But I just want to read to you the description that was beneath the video, and I want to see to what extent you agree with it. It says, for the Plymouth Brethren, the family is central to our beliefs and way of life. We enjoy time together just like other families around the world. Our children grow up loved and cared for and are able to enjoy their childhood in a strong, caring community where corporal punishment is not practiced. By following the guidance of the Holy Bible, We take lessons from the Word of God in our family life, just like we do in all other aspects of our lives. Respect for elders, neighbours, and the general community, property, animals, and the environment, creation, is promoted and upheld as a key principle of life. We are able to ensure the care and loving attention of our children need, while teaching them the values of respect for their parents and faith in God. So, to what extent does that description convey the Brethren's approach to the family?
Ian said earlier about, he doesn't know anybody who's left the Brethren with an intact family, and I can endorse that. In another piece of research I carried out, the percentage of divided families was up at 90-something%. So their respect for the family, okay, so someone leaves, why does that mean that that person is no longer part of the family if they have that much respect for a family? I'm thinking of my brother, for example, who shunned my parents for over 30 years, which is a long time to not hear anything from your firstborn son, because he was the only one in the family to stay behind. So, I mean, that's just for starters. As for animals, they brought out an edict once that Brethren were not to have pets. And so large numbers of children watched their beloved dogs and cats, birds, whatever, being put to sleep, being killed. So I'm kind of a bit...
I had no idea of that. They were against pets.
Yeah, completely against pets.
Wow.
Can
It's all to do with competing attachments, if you look at it.
Oh, I see. Right. Yeah.
So you become attached to your pet, you can't be attached to the Brethren. It's kind of a competition between the two then.
Yeah.
So I think.
Can I also point out that there is a great deal in printed Brethren ministry that contradicts what their YouTube channel says? There are many, many pages of Brethren ministry where the speaker emphasizes that your link with the Brethren transcends and is much more important than your link with natural relatives. And for example, I don't know if it's still true, but up until recently it was true that when young people were getting married, their own parents were not invited to the ceremony unless they happened to live in the same city. It was a Brethren event, not a family event. And anyone who had a close link with a strong link with their natural relatives, this link was condemned as being Moabitish, was the word they used. And they were continually being warned against Moabitish influences.
It's interesting. You see the same thing with Jehovah's Witness materials. What they say to the public and what they say to their card-carrying members are often two completely different things. So, but yeah, I just was fascinated to get your response to that. Okay, we're down to my final 3 questions. How does the Brethren respond to apostasy?
Badly. Well, they regard all of us as apostates.
Right.
The minute
would I be regarded as an apostate?
Oh, yes.
Oh, really? Even though I've never been a member?
The whole of Christendom is condemned as being apostate.
Oh, right. So even though I'm not religious anymore, would I be an apostate?
Well, you're part of Christendom. You're part of the world that where Christianity has held sway.
Right.
Christendom. It's almost a geographical term.
Right.
And the whole of Christendom, especially the west of the Western world, is regarded as apostate. And that means, Christendom means anything, any part of the world really that is not members of the Hill's exclusive brotherhood.
How does you mentioned, what was the term you used? Ministries. What do the ministries say about apostates and what they are like as people?
one of the things they say is that there's no hope for apostates. they base this on some rather ominous verse in Hebrews, I think, or is it the epistles of Peter, but no one who has become apostate can be recovered to the faith. In effect, that's what they think the verse implies. So they use very strong language without spelling it out. They're trying to tell you that if you're an apostate, you're on your way to everlasting torment in the lake of fire.
Well, that sounds nice.
They also regard some of us, I don't know whether they regard all of us, but some of us certainly, where Satan is doing his work through us.
Especially you, Jill.
Especially me, yes. I've had that said to me.
Well, it's quite an honour to have you on the channel then. It's quite a distinguished guest.
Yes.
But we have...
Joking aside, that's actually... The first time that was said to me, that was really scary.
Yeah.
Because, of course, it triggered off all the indoctrinations of my childhood. You know, to be thought of as the epitome of evil when you've spent your whole childhood trying to be the opposite, that kind of is quite triggering. All that. But I'm okay with it now, as you've gathered, because I laugh. But yeah. And the other thing, going on from what Ian said, I can't ever be a Christian again, because if you've left, you can't call yourself a Christian.
Sure. Which is interesting, because the vast majority of people who call themselves Christians or who profess to be Christians have higher morals than the ones that we've outlined in this video. When it comes to the Jehovah's Witness view of apostates, they use very strong language. So they talk about apostates eating at the table of demons, having gangrenous words. There was a watchtower, the July 15th, 2011 watchtower, described apostates as mentally diseased. I could go on, but yeah, they use very colourful language to describe people who dare to question the leadership.
Yeah. I think the sheer numbers of Jehovah's Witnesses, and therefore also former Jehovah's Witnesses, means that you guys have kind of reached critical mass. So there's enough people out there who are being critical of the Jehovah's Witnesses for them to be rightfully, in a way, concerned about it, because you're undermining their standing, their whole faith, aren't you? Whereas with ex-brethren, because there's only much smaller pool, there are not many of us who are standing up. So maybe that's why we don't all get kind of the same kind of words thrown at us. I don't know.
Why is that? Why aren't they? Because if I look at Scientology, we're talking a membership of maybe 25,000 actual members, and yet the ex-Scientology / anti-Scientology movement is massive. There are probably hundreds of people who are involved in that kind of activism. So what's different about Exclusive Brethren?
I think in Scientology, they also go out and proselytize, don't they? So they're used to going out and speaking, whereas the Brethren are very insular. They're very isolationist. They only ever really talk amongst themselves. They wouldn't know how to talk to you.
That's interesting. Yeah.
So I think we find it actually quite hard to speak out. Especially when there are threats made against those of us that do speak out. We get threats. Therefore, that kind of silences some of the others, you know, and because there aren't enough of us to kind of create that critical mass, it somehow doesn't quite take off. With Scientology, of course, they attract quite a few well-known people with, you know, status and so on. So they're famous people. So I don't know whether that has a bearing on it.
It's an interesting theory, and actually you touch on the threat of the organisation to those who speak out, and this actually touches on my penultimate question, which is sort of selfish, because this is my first video that deals with criticising the Exclusive Brethren, and I'm a YouTuber, and YouTubers get takedown requests. So my penultimate question is, how litigious is the Brethren in defending itself against criticism?
About as litigious as the Scientology church.
Right.
They're very litigious, and they spend vast amounts of money on hiring the most expensive lawyers they can find. They don't go for little local lawyers, they go for great big city firms. They have employed Kingsley Natley, for instance, in London, who's the law company that represents the Queen in all her legal affairs. And they don't threaten to take you to local court. In England, they threaten to take you to the High Court. In Scotland, they threaten to take you to the Court of Session, which is the highest court there is in Scotland.
Wow. So
they just to reassure you a little bit, an awful lot of it is bluster. So I mean, I've lost count of how many letters I've had from various lawyers that they've hired. They seem to go. I mean, the only successful case they've had was a copyright infringement, or they've managed to close down 2 or 3 websites, but.
Their case for copyright infringement was not successful. You're talking about the case in Vermont against the...
No, not that one.
No.
Sorry, not copyright. I'll retract that. I meant data protection. Was it data? No, it was copyright. The incident last year with the address book.
The address books affair,
yeah. Yeah, it was copyrighted, but it was also about data protection, wasn't it?
Well, usually in these videos, I try to show actual video material from the organization that we're dealing with. And I did toy with the idea of including the clip that I referred to earlier, but I just had a hunch that it would be better to describe it. And I'm now glad that I did that. I've actually only ever had one letter from, the one letter and a few emails from Watchtower's lawyers. But yeah. So that brings me to my final question, and I'd love to hear from both of you on this. What would you say to a member of the Brethren who stumbles on this video?
Well, I would like to assure any members of the Brethren that I don't wish them any harm at all. For the individual members, I wouldn't try to persuade them to leave the Brethren or not, but if they had decided to leave, I would be very willing to do what I could to advise and help them. And as for the organization itself, I don't want to see it tumbling down in chaos with a cataclysmic end. I want to see it undergoing a radical program of reformation. I want to see it evolving back into something that could be recognized as a genuine Christian church.
I think I would agree with that. I have never, in all the time that I've been talking to current or people that have just left, I've never once attempted to persuade someone to leave, because that choice has to be theirs. They've had their choices taken away from them in the whole of their life up to that point. But what I will do is tell them what it's like out here, what they can expect, what help they can expect, what help I can offer, what help other people can offer, and show them really that what the Brethren have taught them, that is that we're all, we're evil out here, and that if they leave, terrible things will happen to them. Just show them that actually that isn't true, by showing them love and caring and compassion, because they are in a very difficult position when they start wondering whether they are in the right place or not. And it can be very hard for them to learn how to actually question what they've been taught all their life up to that point. It's very, very difficult. And they know perfectly well that should they choose to leave, they will lose all their family that are left in the Brethren. And that can mean losing their children, or their parents, or their brothers, sisters. And of course, all their friends as well. So the loss that they face is huge. It's like the threat in the brethren wants them, maybe what's making them think, I want to leave, I can't stay here any longer. But then they see the threat outside as well, which actually isn't there, but that's what they see. And they also see what will happen to them if they leave. They know if they leave that this huge loss awaits them, not just family and friends, but their job most likely, their house possibly sometimes, but also the whole structure of their belief system that they've built up over those years. It all goes. And that's quite a fearful void to face, I think.
Indeed. And I think it's just nice that they can hear that understanding from you and know that what they're experiencing isn't unique. And I think in the case of lots of people who are in cults or high control groups and are thinking about leaving, it's just a matter of reassuring them that they're not alone.
Exactly.
And that these are shared experiences.
Yes, I agree. Of course, when I left, I was alone because all the internet, nothing like that was around in those days. So that's partly what drives me to be available to people now, because I didn't have it, and I don't want anybody going through that, really.
Indeed, and you are available, and I notice you out on Twitter. So I'll probably share a link to your Twitter on the description in case anyone wants to reach out. But no, I'm very grateful to both of you for joining me for what's been a fascinating conversation. We've covered so much ground, and as I suspected, uncovered a great deal of commonality between Jehovah's Witnesses and Exclusive Brethren.
Yeah.
So thank you to both of you for joining me.
Well, thank
Thank you for
Lauren.
inviting us.
Thank you.
Okay, so viewers, I hope you have enjoyed this conversation as much as I have. Please don't forget that to watch similar videos, all you need to do is to subscribe to my John Cedars channel. But for now, I hope you've enjoyed this, and as always, thank you for watching.